Hello and welcome back to Parley. This prompt was written by Bionicme. Hope you'll enjoy listening. It's about a little bit of friction that comes up when build systems are put into their contexts. Sometimes the way a build system is used in a game, especially in games with other human players playing together, against, or even with each other, can kind of damage or ruin a build system that otherwise seems like good, it's doing its job well. Bionicme begins, this parlay is coming from two recent conversations stirred in your mind a bit in other directions, broadly about how different builds and the different contexts and mentalities in which they're devised can cause problems when they're made to interact. One conversation was with a close friend of mine who strongly enjoys competitive PvP in games. He's also a longtime Warframe player, but his mood to play the game has been increasingly infrequent in recent years. Now, I personally consider Warframe to be, if not ideal, then certainly a very good game for making and sticking to your own build choices. It's very easy for almost any build to clear the bar of being good enough, and I've played with thoughts of a loosely defined set of conditions for this. Those being somewhat in order of priority. 1. Can the build successfully be used to complete the objectives set by the game or the player? 2. Do you find the build enjoyable and or comfortable to use? And 3. Does the build clear the first condition, successfully completing the objective, at an acceptable pace in an acceptably quick amount of time? The second and third conditions are very subjective by design, because I believe that what makes a good build is largely defined by the satisfaction of the user, and meeting those conditions would make a build at bare minimum good enough, even if there's room for improvement. I was sharing these thoughts with my friend when he came with a counterpoint that I hadn't at all considered. They said, but then someone else could just come and wipe the entire room with the press of a button. While this statement doesn't exactly contradict my idea, I found it hard to refute, as that is absolutely something that can happen in Warframe, and something that the both of us have been bothered by in the past. In effect, it is someone with different personal parameters for the above conditions, using a build befitting that, which despite the co-op nature of the game, still ends up with one player directly having a negative impact on someone else's fun. I will be pausing at the end of this first section, this first conversation, to talk, and then the second one. But let's just briefly pause here and break this down. What a great example. So both players are acting in their best interests to fulfill those conditions you set up before. Can the build successfully be used to complete the objective set by the game or the player? Do you find it enjoyable or comfortable to use? And then does the build, complete the objective in a timely manner? And those are subjective things. It's not even really possible for you to need to complete the objective in a timely manner if it's not on a literal timer. And therefore, a lot of builds, a very wide variety of approaches to solve those conditions will appeal to various players and feel like kind of the obvious or default answer. So it's possible that a player will have a definition for those terms where completing the mission quickly enough or in a comfortable way will mean instantly deleting every enemy on the screen. But if that player has that definition of those terms, that is what's fun to them, we'll get back to this, but that's what they think is fun to them. Then other players who have a definition that is slower, I think it's mostly that third condition, what pace does it clear the content at that the player finds acceptable? If anybody thinks that definition is slower than another player, they basically get left behind. You can't any longer decide to complete the objective slower if one player decides that the acceptable speed is faster than what you find acceptable. You simply cannot play if a player decides on that. Such a small thing. It seems like such a small disagreement, and yet, yeah, at its worst, this makes Warframe's co-op quite literally unplayable. Just that small thing, that's it, and suddenly the whole game doesn't work, just from that small thing. At least sometimes. So we'll get back to it, but right, what a great example, and yes, definitely a big problem with Warframe. Bionicme continues, but sure, I said, it is possible to just not play with public matchmaking on. I play solo all the time, as well as on public, so do I. And when playing with friends, we have a good time just playing by ourselves. Or, yeah, like you can play co-op with one other person. Then my friend hit me with something I'm still somewhat baffled by. That even just the knowledge that someone else could be doing that map wiping thing while he was off on his own enjoying his suboptimal jank was enough to negatively impact his enjoyment of the game. to the degree that it was a reason why he hadn't been interested in Warframe as much lately. He blames it on an issue of balance, but I'm not sure it's quite that simple. And in the first place, I don't share this sentiment at all. But then, unlike him, I'm a player with nary a crumb of competitive ambition. Nary a crumb of competitive ambition is actually my upcoming autobiography's title. Um, Glorious. Okay, so right. The conclusion, and I've heard this many times before as well, Bionicme, is that people will say, well, because people like could do that, even if I play in a way where they never do that. You know, I'm playing solo all the time. Let's imagine like that. So no one is actually doing that to me. No one is using their build that if it clears the game at a speed that they find acceptable but is too fast for me to get to play. No one is actually doing that to me, and yet it still kind of makes the game worse in, let's say, my perception. I'm acting on behalf of your friend. I kind of share this sentiment, and I will explain why I think it, and also speculate why perhaps your friend thinks it, but it isn't as it's definitely not a balance issue in my opinion. So I'll give you my take, and then we'll move on. But these are both really connected points. I'm glad you included both. We'll just briefly summarize this one. I think that the reason is that the fun of the game is the fantasy that you can build things to your preferences using those parameters you laid out. Part of the fantasy of getting to make a build is that you can make the game play the way you want it to play. That there are all these options, and that within reason you can pick, from those options. But rather than just the checklist that the player can use to decide what builds they would enjoy or find acceptable, rather than just the way that every player decides on what builds are kind of good enough for them, I would also like to suggest that these terms are also a little bit objective. There is a way that the game demonstrates, gives you feedback on what is kind of good enough. And in this way, the game kind of gives you a base net or wall to play your game of tennis with you yourself in the game with. There's a kind of somewhat objective barrier that the game puts up that you get to make your builds in response to. You're making builds like against something. If this concept sounds complicated, I hope it now doesn't. That you're just making the build against some known challenges. The missions are like this, and so you make a build like that. You know that there's defense missions in the game, so you make a build that's good at like the way defense missions work in this game. That's it. But the problem is that we've gone beyond the players just saying what they want as an acceptable build. There actually is somewhat of an objective marker for what is an acceptable build. And if other players make their builds in different ways, what is an acceptable build, or what applies to those somewhat objective challenges the game offers, also changes. The players are actually literally changing the game in a way. And this happens because Warframe is too broad. I guess that's going to be my thesis for this whole parlay. This and the other conversation you're going to mention in a moment are fundamentally problems of games with build systems that are co-op, that can involve other players, being too broad. And you don't see that often, and this is more or less why, in my opinion, because you can essentially make the game unplayable in a way that there isn't really a way to fix. Like, the core of the game requires that players are able to make other people unable to play the game. And the kind of fundamental fantasy of the game is I can make builds in this or that way. And so by doing that, I can make the game feel how I want. And with that ability, I have no way to kind of avoid making other players play a game they didn't want to play. I can make the mission be a bunch of enemies spawn and you kill them instantly as quickly as you can, a Wild West shootout. But then nobody else can play if they have a build that does something else. And now you can see how perhaps Bionicme's friend, Bionicme your friend, might have thought of this as a balance issue. You can imagine some, not to be rude, but like impossible, non-existent world where someone could, in theory, balance things in such a way that there are many, many, many options and they all still feel fun, but nothing gets quite like so out of control. I think that for the purpose of discussion, we should be willing to say that that's like kind of impossible, though. It's not realistic without a system built from the bottom up to be like easier to balance in some fundamental way. It's not realistic for normal build system, I guess if you want to say that way, to be balanced so well that players can only create one type of experience with it, yet it feels like there is a wide variety of options. That's possible to do, but I don't think that if you don't build a game around that, I think we can agree it's not that realistic. You would have to balance a very, very large number of game components, and you'd have to do it all really well to not just be reducing the number of interesting builds. You'd have to make them all still good, but just like not really, really broken. Now, credit where credit's due. I actually think that Warframe is sort of kind of close to that, and it's just that players really want to find these things. They want to find the thing that kills everything in the mission instantly. And we'll come back to that a little bit later, but there is an element of, I was saying before, of what the player thinks they think is fun. And they may be, let me come back to it, kind of wrong about that. There is a way to push back against this, in my opinion, where you criticize the player, yes, but ultimately we can't do anything about that. The player might be wrong in a way we can demonstrate to be pursuing that type of fun, but we can't actually change that. We can only change the game, and so it sort of doesn't matter, but I still want to come back to it for a point later. So for this first point, to summarize, I think that the primary issue is just that the game itself, the game's challenge, kind of is including the players, with other players involved or present. And so when you play with other players, certainly they can change the challenge presented to you. When you don't play with other players, your experience of making a build against the sort of objective challenge the game is presented, I think it's fair to say, has been affected by your awareness that you don't really need to do this. You would rather just do things this way, but it's been unremovably revealed to you that that is like a waste of time in a way. And that is kind of frustrating. Like there is a sort of to needing to pretend that this is a fun way to play that is efficient, instead of it just like being that the way you find fun is a reasonable way to play, even if you knew more. So that's what I think it is. I think that there's a kind of a thought you can't remove, a truth you can't hide from when you see other players obliterating the mission that reveals that the happy medium you'd reached with the game's design is actually kind of false. And that does harm part of the fun, which is playing off the game's sort of objective challenge. Other players have kind of changed your perception of that, and thus it might not be fun in the same way. Your understanding of how the game is challenging, the challenges the game presents, and then you making builds to kind of respond to that in some way, to some extent, I think really is affected by other players making you aware that you could tackle that challenge in other ways, even if you actually no longer play with players that are doing that. Your perception of what the game's presented challenge for you to make builds around is, the game's opportunity cost a little bit, has been changed, and you can't just like unchange it. You could come to a state where you just accept that that's not as fun. But speaking from my personal experience as someone who sometimes does that, I mean, it's still the game's fault. Good game design is to avoid these problems. It's not like I wouldn't tell a player, oh, but just like you just don't have to care about that. I mean, you can be ignorant and just forget that. That's fine. And there can be something good about kind of setting that aside. I'm not trying to offend anyone. I am trying sometimes to be slightly ignorant of the fact that I could clear it quicker. I'm not ignorant of it. I accept it, and I just want my own fun in this way. But it would still be better if I didn't have to do that. That's work I have to do to adjust the game to be the way I find it fun. It would still be better if I didn't have to do that. Hopefully people would be willing to agree there, right? Even if you blame the player, you blame Bionicme's friend, and they should just get over it and enjoy what they enjoy. Okay, but like they do have to do that, right? And so the game could be doing that work for them. And a lot of games that a lot of people like do that work for the player. It's not like a virtue for them to need to do that themselves. It's just, yes, it is obviously useful if you're willing to, sure. But I mean, there are lots of games where you don't have to do that. So hopefully people would, I don't know, I'm trying to imagine theoretical detractors to this argument, what they would say. Hopefully that is a line of reasoning where you'd at least accept, okay, but it would be nice if you didn't have to. Sure. I was just going to say that even in games where I try to adapt and make the game more like what I would enjoy, rather than being kind of made aware, of this overarching strategy that makes things kind of trivial. I think of an example in, Arknights. If you play Arknights W, Alter, with Saddle, and if you don't play Arknights, there's this unit in Arknights that has like pretty much the biggest range of any unit and does big AoE attacks, and they hit multiple times, and they hit for a lot of damage, and they do physical damage, which bypasses the game's primary defenses pretty effectively if it's a single big hit of physical damage. She stuns enemies, she can hit enemies in the air or on the ground, which her archetype usually can't. She comes with a bunch of units that tank damage. She is essentially the best of every single unit in the entire game, all in one package. She is a new level of power creep. I have maybe never seen a unit that so much dumpsters the entire game by herself. It is not an exaggeration to say that many Arknights missions you'd rather have her than 12 other units, a whole other team of units. She is preposterously overpowered. She is game-breakingly overpowered in a way that is rarely seen, even in games that don't rein this in. And Arknights is a game that largely does rein that in, so it's even more egregious. There's nothing even close to that level of power creep in the game, in my opinion, except for her. I own this unit, and she's fully, leveled out or whatever. And I rarely use her. I use her as a delete button for content that I feel was balanced poorly, but I want the rewards from. She basically just lets me extract the rewards from an activity that I have tried to engage with in a way I find fun and just can't, or where I feel like the gimmick is not actually that well made game design and I just would rather delete it with raw power. And she can do that in spectacular fashion very easily. Very convenient unit to own or borrow. She's easy to borrow. You don't really need to own this unit. And indeed, I didn't roll for her. I just got her as from the ether. I avoid using that predominant strategy. It's kind of similar to this example we're talking about here. And yet, I would report to you that I largely try to avoid that strategy by using the game's systems to adjust the power level of various options. For example, something I do in Arknights is I don't level any unit up all the way, except if I feel like they're like truly underpowered, like the game design was in error and they should have been buffed. And so I kind of use the game's leveling system to buff units that like don't have it. Not in a very extreme way. I don't do anything but like not level them up all the way. There's not much I'm adding, but I am giving them a kind of 20%-ish or whatever stat buff by leveling only those units all the way up. And it saves a lot of resources too. It's not a very efficient resource use to level units up all that way. But you see my point. Even in cases where I would report to you that I do this, I try to just like forget about the fact that who cares that you can overpower this mission with this one strategy. I would still prefer it to just be that it objectively isn't that much of an overwhelming strategy. And I try to make that be the case rather than purely trying to pretend that it isn't like that, I guess. So yeah, that would be my summary of this first part. I think that it does affect part of the game design of the game. And the culprit is that Warframe is too open-ended. It offers you too many options for a game that allows other players to affect your performance in missions. Or another way to put it is Warframe doesn't really have a lot of great alternatives to that. There are a good amount of mission types in Warframe to go a level deeper on the like just play solo subject. There are a lot of mission types in Warframe that are designed for you to be with co-op partners, at least one. And while I have made loadouts that are kind of designed to overcome that limitation, I would argue that there are a significant amount of parts of Warframe that are designed to be played co-op. They are not designed to work well solo. You can do it. It's not even necessarily particularly hard should you set your mind to it. I'm speaking from personal experience. But I don't think that they are designed well for you to need to play solo, if you want to put it that way. So this won't be a problem for a lot of people. Whenever any type of discussion of game design like this comes up, people have a hugely difficult time accepting that a thing is a problem with the game if it isn't a problem for them. And I don't really want to get into that in this video because it comes up with almost every single topic anybody ever raises about game design. I hope I adequately explained what I see as being the unfortunate reality of this situation for some people, and hopefully people who aren't bothered by that can just be nice and acknowledge that it would certainly be good if people could play the game the way that they wanted to, and the game isn't like objectively designed to be played in one single way, which is what leads to the problem in the first place. To put it another way before we move on, I'm not trying to tell you, Johnny One-Shots, that you shouldn't kill every enemy instantly, if that's the way you find the game fun. I'm saying that what would be ideal is obviously if there were two games, one of which was designed for what you like, and one of which was designed for what I like, rather than one game that isn't designed for what either of us likes, and which you can use to remove my ability to play the way I want if I play co-op. You don't want to remove my ability to play. You want to play the way you want to play. And I want you to play the way you want to play too. But neither of us can do that at present, as much as we could be having fun. Although you can do it more than I can, Johnny One-Shots. Anyway, moving on. Bionicme says, the other conversation was one I had with our fellow crew member Vampbug, who I've been playing the occasional game of Magic the Gathering Commander with. These are such great examples, by the way, Bionicme, as we get into this one. They're really, really good. His appetite for the game, Vampbug's, has far exceeded mine, though, and he's been seeking out content creators and their communities for it, for which he has shared content with me that occasionally features another sentiment I find baffling. It begins with the argument that playing with the intent to win is crucial to keep a good pace in Commander, to avoid slogfests, and that players who don't, who affect the game state without directly bending it toward their victory, are doing an almost morally bad thing, or playing a badly built deck. But then I have seen this sentiment followed up with, among others, the examples of counterspelling what would have been someone else's winning spell, as an example of what not to do. But doesn't that contradict the always play to win adage? If someone else wins, that means you do not. So using any means available to you in order to prevent that should be the right action to take, no? It almost seems like the goal is not to win the game, but to end the game. Yet kingmaking is also condemned in the same breath, a strategy that aims to claim second place by unilaterally assisting one opponent in order to defeat the other two. This turned out to be an impression apparently echoed by at least one member of the community in question, who, after receiving backlash from their fellows, after threatening a board wipe late in the game, left with a dejected, "I guess the point of the game is not to play." There's a little more, but again, I'll pause here to break down this, again, excellent example. Yeah, a classic problem in Magic the Gathering, and why I cannot be bothered to try to play with people in public forums. I never play Magic the Gathering with people I don't know well, and this is essentially the reason why. People just don't know how to think about the game in a way that is productive and intellectual, and instead throw around the buzzword of, you're doing it wrong, or the internet said you're doing it wrong, to explain something they do not fully understand. But I think I do, so again, I will tell you my understanding, and just say, I don't think other people have really followed through that claim as far as it can go. So let's do it now. People are saying that wiping the board or counterspelling someone's winning spell isn't playing to win, is bad. That's obviously not true in a basic way, as Bionicme pointed out. If somebody plays a spell that says you win the game, and in Magic the Gathering there are spells that literally say you win the game, if this resolves and you meet the conditions. Approach of the Second Sun, I don't know, there's plenty others. If you counterspell that we can agree that cannot not be you trying to win the game, because if they cast that spell, you instantly lose. What that spell does is make you lose the game. So that is you trying to win the game. If people feel like it isn't you trying to win the game, we just need to find out why that feels that way. It isn't you trying not to win the game, but why does it feel like it is? So rather than taking other people's perception of the game as gospel and doing something I think is really, really slow downing in stymieing, I don't know, in a lot of discussions like this, and assuming that the people with the complaint are correct about the complaint, rather than just that their frustration is real, but maybe the situation isn't what it seems. Let's follow it through. Again, people that are frustrated by this phenomenon themselves, I'm not telling you that your feeling of frustration is wrong, but we can all agree that it can't really work to not allow players to stop a spell from winning the game, right? So where is the frustration coming from? Let's find it. And ideally, this will benefit people who are annoyed by that, more. if not the same amount as the rest of us. So let's put together a situation. So one of the examples here is the game has been going on for a while, and a player is going to wipe the board. They're going to play a spell that kills everything on the board, with the drawback of killing their stuff. But if the board is really bloated, it's a 4-player game, they're going to get a lot of value out of that. Why is that not trying to win the game? Well, they wipe the board. It resolves, and they wipe the board. Everyone's creatures are dead. The concern, of course, is that people feel like the game has just been reset. Things have been kind of rolled back to a previous state, and you just need to keep playing. But let's really look at what happened in that situation. In fact, let's go a little bit further. The player plays land destruction, and not just any land destruction. They play mass land destruction, destroying the resource at the heart of Magic the Gathering, other people's ability to produce mana and play spells. How can this not be setting the game back a few turns, right? But let's watch what happens. So play the mass land destruction. You don't play the board wipe now. You play a mass land destruction spell instead. Well, what you've done is, let's say it's Armageddon. You destroy everyone's lands. I don't care what spell it is. It doesn't matter. There are spells that do that. That's good enough. You destroy everyone's lands, but they keep everything else they had. Okay, so the player that was ahead is more ahead, aren't they? Because nobody can play things to interact with the board for a few turns while they rebuild their mana resources. If you are the player that's ahead, and you destroy everybody's lands, and then you swing in with a bunch of creatures to win, it's very difficult to argue that that is not trying to win the game. What did your board wipe spell do, your land wipe spell do, other than cause you to win the game? It did. It prevented other people. You basically just casted a lot of counter spells, a lot of uncounterable counter spells that made your opponent's removal that would have destroyed your creatures and prevented you from winning impossible to play. You cast the kind of super counter spell. Now, pause here. Maybe that spell is too powerful to be fun. Maybe getting ahead by a little bit and then being able to just delete everybody's mana production and lock in the win is too strong. Yeah, in fact, I agree that it is. And in my playgroup, we do not allow spells that wipe all lands non-conditionally because they are too good at that job. They're too powerful at that. But we simultaneously do not have a single deck that has a way to easily fit it that doesn't contain land destruction. I'll repeat, almost every deck that we play in my pod plays land destruction, but we don't allow any mass land destruction, and only true mass land destruction, like things that destroy literally all lands with no conditions. There are a few cards that destroy, I don't remember exactly, but there's a card that destroys 3 lands from every player sacrifices 3 lands or something like that. We do allow that. I don't think that that is too strong of a way to lock in a win. If you play good interaction, well, I've given away the game, haven't I? If you play good interaction, you will be able to still play some after a player plays a spell that destroys 3 of your lands, provided they don't play that spell in a deck that's one task in life is to accelerate that card out by turn 3. It doesn't, And we'll get back to that later, too. So to paint the picture again, the problem with the board wipe killing everyone's creatures, then, is not, I propose, that it isn't trying to win the game, but is only that what happens afterward must sufficiently often be that players do not use that board wipe to win the game. Is that fair? So again, people that are frustrated by this, I'm not telling you that you're wrong to be frustrated by the effects of the board wipe, but just that it's like the board wipe itself. If you think about the format, it's obviously bad for an important piece of counterplay, wiping the board when things have gotten too clogged up, to like not be allowed or to be stymied or maligned. It's good for that to exist if people use the board wipe state to win the game. And so if you're bothered by that, it's because their deck otherwise doesn't then go on to try to win the game. Suddenly we're piecing it together. Let's read the beginning of the complaint again. Bionicme said, "It begins with the argument that playing with the intent to win is crucial to keep a good pace in Commander games to avoid slogfests, and that players who don't, who affect the game state without directly bending it toward their victory, are doing an almost morally bad thing or playing a badly built deck." Okay. At this point, I have to agree. If you play board wipes and don't build your deck around winning the game after the board wipe, that is a badly built deck. Why exactly does the deck want to wipe the board or play a game plan that wins slowly enough that it can't take advantage of wiping the board? You see what I mean? On the other hand, we can go forward and say, Bionicme continues, it is at this point that I must confess that I am a player with an inclination toward that much maligned slogfest. As card games go, I have a long history with Yu-Gi-Oh!, a game with power creep so far evolved that a turn count above 3 could be considered a vestigial trait. Savage Burn. Thus, when I consider playing a game of Magic the Gathering, I like to take advantage of the opportunity to play at a slower pace. And regardless of your personal preferences, an enormous majority of players don't like it when the game ends really fast, but also complain if it ends too slowly, as we just established. You're hardly alone in wanting games that last more than 3 or 4 turns. Plenty of people like that, that's fine. A lot of people want that same thing. And I am a Golgari player at heart. After my own heart, Bionicme. Welcome, my dear comrade. Like a creeping mycelial infection, the unhurried yet unceasing accumulation of resources and power through persistent engines, recursion, and graveyard scaling, the slow simmer that never loses steam and wins through sheer overwhelming value, is a strategy and a fantasy that I quite enjoy. Even a red burn deck I have is built with sustainable green principles. Interesting. In this, considering the examples mentioned above, I'm probably not the kind of player some people would enjoy playing against, especially should I be successful in my goals, though I doubt Vampug and Pod are often bothered. They find ways to connect 7 damage with my face on turn 4 with astounding regularity, Ebon Death flavored or otherwise. But I hold that if a game is good, it should withstand the act of being played, emphasis is mine, not to be actively sought to be ended. Absolutely. So Bionicme, here I think we have the second half of the issue. There are patterns of play that when we say wiping the board doesn't directly win the game, and then other people have built their deck badly because they're like not winning the game off of the board wipe. We've hopefully agreed that it's stupid to object to the board wipe in the abstract, but someone wipes the board and then they don't win the game fast, basically. People will then feel justified, right? They'll feel like, well, see, you didn't use the board wipe to win the game. You're basically just drawing it out. But let's go one step further. Let's imagine that the person is acting in good faith to try to have a fun game of Magic. Do they have no plan to win the game? Or do they have a plan to win the game, and the players annoyed by the board wipe are just glossing over it because they're used to a general problem that I'm sure does exist of people wiping the board with no plan for how to win? Do the people that do have a plan to win after they wipe the board, but their plan to win after wiping the board is slow, get rolled in with people who wipe the board and they don't have a clear plan to win? Exactly how clear does the plan to win have to be? And of course, this is where we start to talk about the social contract. This is where Vampug and Pod probably just understand that you're acting in good faith. And so if you wipe the board, they know you're playing a value engine that used the board wipe to win. You have every intention of winning, and with their experience playing against your deck, they might even be able to look at the board and go, yeah, it's pretty clear how that left you better off than the rest of us. If your deck is full of Vengevines and Gravecrawlers, and you wipe the board, and they pop right out of the graveyard again, I don't think it's rocket science to figure out how that means you're going to win by having wiped the board. Like, absolutely. And I think a lot of players just overlook that. Now, again, players that just overlook that, I'm on your side here at the end of the day. You're overlooking that because most of the time it's bad. Most of the time you feel like players are wiping the board not in service of any plan to win. How can you police people's decks in a way where you can guarantee that they're like properly trying to win? What does that even mean? Like, how do you determine that? This Golgari example is absolute perfection. This is the perfect example of a strategy that has all these stupid black board wipes that kill everything, even if it's indestructible or hexproof. They kill everything, but then bring stuff back from their graveyard and inexorably crawl toward winning. These are really powerful, robust strategies that I think have an incredibly obvious way by which they win. But if someone plays a deck that is green and black and has a board wipe, I mean, how many other cards do they have to have that signal that they're doing that kind of thing for you to feel reassured that they're actually going to try to move the game forward? There isn't, I mean, there's no, there's no answer to that, of course. The best thing is to have some sort of social contract. However, this is another example of a game being so open-ended that there really isn't a way to keep it focused. You can't just ban a bunch of stuff. Well, you could, but you would have to ban a truly shocking number of things. Let's imagine that you did that for a moment. This parlay is going to be long if I do it too much, but it's an easy example to demonstrate the principle of the thing with. Ban every single recursive creature in the entire format, and also ban a lot of the good draw engines in the format. So that's like thousands of cards, but you've banned them all now. And now you might say that wiping the board is so much less likely to be a good thing to do on your way to winning that it doesn't really make sense to do. And shotgun type removal that removes multiple permanents at once but doesn't remove everything all at once would maybe get more popular in that environment because it would be better for people that are genuinely trying to win. And people's complaint that board wipes don't move the game forward would be more justified. It would be harder to play a strategy where wiping the board clean frequently resulted in you actually moving the game forward in like a non-obvious way, you know. I will still assert, I think the reason most people react so negatively to this, yes, is ultimately because they're maybe not looking quite carefully enough at what the result of the board wipe was. Again, a lot of people, the moment they see your Armageddon, the moment they see your Wrath of God, they instantly complain. They do not think about what its effect was, they instantly complain. This is bad. That's not fair. You have to say what you feel like is stagnating the game and ask yourself about that individual who played the card. Are they a person who doesn't want the game to end, or are they trying to win? They as a person, did they want to win, or are they trying to stall out the game? Are they trolling the pod? Again, what people think is fun. There are people in the world who are trying to troll the pod and waste their time. They feel like they're a better person for having done that, and those people suck and you shouldn't play with them. And sure, if you honestly evaluate it and you feel like that's what the person is doing, judge them rightly and say that it's because they're stalling out the game. But it's not because the board wipe is an inherently unproductive thing to do. The board wipe is an important part of a format where people stagnate the board. Hell, if you play a grindy strategy, the board wipes are an even more integrated part of the strategy because they blow up your stuff. You know, they're there as a part of the format. It would be interesting as a project for somebody who plays with a lot of public groups, which I don't, and so I don't have like as much. I mean, I used to, so that's where these comments are coming from. But I don't anymore. I just know from this exact same amount of complaints coming out that people are still having this negative experience. When you see a board wipe happen in a game at your table, try something for me. And if anybody does this, please report back. I will happily give you a free parlay if you do this and tell me about it. Send me the notes. Take a notepad with you. Go play Magic with public players or whatever. And every time there is a board wipe, write down what happens. You know, why was the board wiped in a short summary? And how do people react? Did they react positively, negatively? Not at all. Did it get countered? How did people feel about that? Because surely, if you think about Commander overall, it beggars belief that people are complaining about every time the board is wiped. No. I mean, maybe in some groups. I'm sure there are some groups like that. But I think there are conditions under which people think that it is a good thing for the game, and conditions under which people don't feel like it is doing anything other than, you know, not moving the game forward. Okay. Conclusion time, but those are my thoughts. I'm just going to read the last line of Bionicme's second part again because I think it's good and we'll be talking about it more in a minute. I hold, Bionicme repeats, that if a game is good, it should withstand the act of being played, not be actively sought to be ended. In any case, both of these are anecdotes are examples of situations where negative friction can occur due not directly through competition, but because builds designed with entirely different intents of play in mind come together on the same playing field and then basically make each other not work in some way. What are your thoughts on this? And so I've given them to some extent already, of course, as we went. Primarily, it's because these are both examples of games that have build systems that involve co-op or competitive play that are so open-ended, the game cannot guarantee a set state of affairs in gameplay. And in the Warframe example, one playstyle kind of supersedes the other. Interestingly, in the Magic the Gathering example, we have a stasis where the community has decided that that way of wiping the board, kind of a similar thing, ironically, is bad enough that they're pushing back against it. Now, in both cases, we can acknowledge that abilities that wipe all the enemies on the map, or at least are a big AoE in Warframe, should be part of the game. It is good for those abilities to be in the game. The game design benefits from abilities that hit a large number of targets in a horde shooter, obviously. And the issue is with how you could say the power level of those abilities kind of bowls over other people's ability to play. But I would place the blame more at the fact that the game hasn't really thought through how it will affect co-op for abilities like that to exist. I'm not even sure I agree that it's bad for abilities like that to be powerful. It's just that in the game we have, there is no recourse against players using that to kind of overwrite other people's experience. So while you could blame it on balance, I pointed out before that it's really hard to do that balance like humanly good, such that all these different options really don't allow players any way. And remember, not a single one, because if there's only one left, people are just going to use that one all the time. Having more is almost better because then it's not as tedious if it feels necessary to people. So that's one thing. Now, again, in Warframe, I feel like there is kind of a solution. Personally, I wouldn't be that opposed to the idea of a kind of AoE or target cap, I guess if you want to say it that way. Something like that. You might be able to program the game in a way where the AoE effects are just as strong as they currently are and stay as big as they currently are, and yet it's still kind of interesting from a co-op perspective where you, the player doing the AoE, kind of want other players to not be doing that. And to some extent, I think really tanky enemies, like Eximus enemies or Overguard enemies in Warframe, big tanky elite enemies, kind of get in the direction of filling that role. I think in their current form, they're not quite there, but you could imagine something like that kind of working. Or some sort of drawback where those powerful AoE abilities, should they not kill an enemy, then cannot damage the enemy for a short time, such that you value having strong single target damage as well. But we're not going to try to fix that about Warframe here. We're just going to try to enumerate why it's a problem. And again, I would not necessarily lay the blame directly at balance. I would suggest that it's more of a lack of foresight about the relationship that all these build intentions will have with the player base and how they'll be able to interfere with each other. In Magic, on the other hand, we have a case where, again, we can agree that your board wipe really does need to be in the format in some form. It's very good for a format that allows people to accrue a bunch of value on many sides, to have board wipes like that can be healthy for the format. It's really easy to demonstrate how you'll win that way. And I held off all the way until the end bringing up this point because I don't want to be too persnickety about it, but we need to mention it before we move on. I have seen a lot of games of Magic where people complain about a board wipe happening, and the reason is, like, they say the reason is because it's stalling out the game, but the reason is because it's really bad for their board. And you can look at their board and say, okay, but like, when you built a deck, did you, the player complaining about the board wipe, telling other people their deck is badly built, did you build your deck with it in mind what you would do if your creatures all got killed? No. Yeah, I didn't think so. And so you could have put in counter spells or effects that make your creatures indestructible for a turn, or blink your creatures out of the way, or create value in a way other than playing a grindy value creature. A lot of the time, I'm struck by how people complaining about these games getting ground out themselves play decks that are only equipped to grind out a game. They're not playing any counterplay. Now, I personally feel like, this might just be my bias, that has been overblamed for this problem. I think that the Magic the Gathering community knows that now, and people have overemphasized how much that is the problem. I feel like to some extent it's a lack of player imagination. That's what I laid the blame at. Looking at players who really are going to win the game off the back of that board wipe and saying this is part of the game. I could have played ways to, counter that or protect my board or whatever. But yes, it's absolutely also a part of the game that people don't play enough counterplay to the board wipes. Now, partly this is because, unfortunately, counterspells, as we saw in the example Bionicme mentioned, are often blamed as being something like not in favor of winning. Again, it's easy to demonstrate that in the abstract, it's good for them to exist if they further the game being won, and that it's kind of naive or short-sighted of people to say anything that negates another thing somehow isn't moving you toward winning the game. Like all removal isn't trying to win the game. Like that's just not, like if you want to play an interactive game of Magic, like that, it's just not on the table. Like you're gonna play cards that do things to your opponent's cards, I would hope. Now, again, in a way, you can see how Magic kind of protects this mindset. When you attack in Magic, your opponent gets to pick what you block with. You don't usually interfere with your opponent when you attack in ways that are under your control. You build a board and then you attack, and it's the worst case scenario for your attackers. But I would argue players getting attached to that part of the game, it wouldn't be fair to then say that that's like the core thing about Magic the Gathering, you know, that as if Magic the Gathering isn't normally interactive, I guess. I feel like it really, really is interactive at its core. And that's just a feature of the combat. In fact, part of the reason why there's so much interaction available in Magic is because the combat doesn't let you choose what you attack, meaning it's really valuable to be able to debuff an enemy creature or, you know, kill a guy or whatever. So yes, some of the problem is wrapping in on itself into a terrible Ouroboros, where players complain about players playing things that stall the game, but players only play things which cause the game to stall because players don't play things that prevent those things from stalling the game, but those things are said to stall the game too, and it just endlessly wraps around in itself. I have some suggestions, actually, though they're not very good. Suggestion number one. You could try to enumerate the philosophy of your deck. You can explain that your deck is trying to win by grinding out a game. Now, some people will say this puts me at too much of a disadvantage. Or if I ask my opponents to do this, won't they just lie? But here's the thing, yeah, you sacrifice that in exchange for saying to your opponents, look, like my deck is going to interact with your creatures and try to kill them and stuff within reason. I'm trying to win by having my creatures like come back more often than you'll be able to rebuild. I'm doing that to try to win. I'm not going to wipe the board a ridiculous number of times because that isn't good for my strategy, but I intend to interfere with your gameplay. That simple saying, just saying, I intend to interfere with your plan, is like, so we are on the same page about that, right? You know what I mean? Because a lot of groups aren't. A lot of groups will go, what do you mean? No, that's bad. And look, I'm sorry, but they're not trying to play a game with other people. And that's okay. They can go play with other people who think that way. That's fine, I guess. But it doesn't allow Magic to be played. You cannot say it's wrong to interfere with your opponents. That obviously doesn't work. That does make the point of the game to not play. You must then ask yourself, as a human being frustrated by these other people, why do people want to play in a way where you're not supposed to do anything to your opponents? Why do they want that? Why do those players think they want to do that? That doesn't seem like it would be worth doing. What is the fun of playing in a way where you just solitaire your deck, goldfish your deck, but there are other players there? Why do they think that's fun? There are answers to these questions, though apparently, I've been made aware that they need to wait for another parlay. I mean, that's still a big question. But I encourage you to think about that a little bit. The simple act of getting on the same page and saying, so, but like, as long as I intend to win, I'm trying to do things that let me win. Like, is that okay? That's thing number one. Number two, you could, although I'm sure people won't like this, I said they were bad solutions, okay. You could have one person check through every deck that people play, a third party, I hope, and have them look at each deck with the same biases. Now, in my playgroup, we build decks together, although I lead the deck building, and then we share all of the decks. Like, that's how we play Magic the Gathering Commander. And when I build those decks, I build them with various criteria in mind, and you can do this. You can try to further enumerate a philosophy for what's like okay for a deck. I can't go into the whole thing right now, but I'll just give you an example. You do whichever one you want. You could do it for anything you want, but this is what my group and I like. The deck has a lot of interaction. We're here to play Magic against each other's decks. We want to compete to win. It's a competition. We're trying to win. 2, the decks are from a pool, so of course it doesn't really make sense for anyone to spend a lot of money to make a card, get a card that's way stronger than everyone else. The decks are relatively budget, but if a card can be powerful, cheap, and it's like possible to stop still, yeah, put it in. 3, but there needs to be a way to stop the strategy. If an effect is such a powerful engine that you really can't interact with it, or fundamentally makes less game actions occur in a way that doesn't feel like it moves the game forward, maybe that doesn't work so well. For example, I found it difficult to make a discard focused deck in that pod. If you make all the decks with that mindset in mind, you can even include land destruction to a point, but a deck that steadily relies on constantly making people discard, it's tricky. I have seen a deck by popular YouTuber Celebrius Snail that has Malfagor as the commander, which I think is a really good counterexample. Malfagor's effect is to make everybody sacrifice their creatures, you discard your hand. Imagine an effect like Malfagor, but it makes everyone discard their hand. It's a bomb, a one-time effect in black and red, so it's going to be hard to flicker, that makes everyone discard their hand, but just once. It's very similar to the land wipe or the board wipe thing, right? If you use that to lock in an advantage and push for a win, that could be okay. But a deck that wants to trigger things that say, like, whenever an opponent discards a card, they won't be good unless you steadily make people discard. And I can't find a way for that to be good and fun for everyone at the table at the same time. So I'll ask, we can't talk about it in this parlay, why do some people want to play those strategies? Now, to throw those people a bone for a moment, it might be because they're not convinced that that's the problem. Maybe your playgroup is full of card draw. So there's plenty of interaction even if you play that deck. That's cool. There's various reasons that my pod is constructed in a way where that doesn't work well, but like that, legitimately, like that's great. It might be because they don't realize that it kind of doesn't lead to as much fun as they could be having. They're winning, and it does involve a struggle. Their opponents desperately playing the few cards they have left to try to oppose them. But they just haven't seen what it would be like if people had like a melee of interaction going on. Or maybe they've played that way and they don't like it. And that's not good news because it suggests that they don't really like playing against other people. But I mean, that's the reality of the situation. That's fine. And there could be other less good reasons why they like playing that kind of deck as well. But there could be good reasons. I'm not trying to be facetious, like, you should think about it. And when you think about it, you'll conclude that I'm right and everyone else is wrong. Like, no, you probably won't. But there are answers to why people are motivated this way. And some of them are bad. Yeah, like they might not be the nicest person. Maybe they're sitting on some insecurity and that is coming out in their deck building. Yeah, that is some of the reason why people do that, obviously, I would say. Sure, so you could try to have all decks kind of adhere to the same philosophy. You could try to write those things down, and if you have good friends, they will want an interactive game. They will want to not include things like that. After all, if you, a thoughtful and mature person, think about how you're winning, and you know that the way you won is a way that other players cannot stop you from achieving, if you think about that enough, you will not want to win that way. You will stop wanting to win that way. Now, it might not be clear enough quickly enough. You might need to play it out a little bit. And so I do think part of this solution is be willing to play it out a little bit. Sure. But yeah, I mean, I think some of the potential answer is like, you maybe will discover that that isn't as fun, and you just won't want to build decks that have a kind of overpowered or anticlimactic way to win. Thinking about specifically, rather than that's not what I want you to do to win, but instead thinking, what do I want to do to win, is helpful. And to go back to the Warframe example, since I haven't talked about it that much here at the end, yeah, I mean, like, so what do you want as your ideal play situation? For one thing, there are a lot of other games that are doing more specific versions of Warframe's design. You might like one of those. It might do exactly what you want out of Warframe, and Warframe is too broad and uncooperative for that goal for it to achieve it for you. So, I mean, that's something. Because for Warframe's case, it's not gonna become less broad. No, You can't have that game if you play on public. Like that's not ever going to change, as far as I can tell in Warframe's design. In Magic, you can change it yourself. In Warframe, of course, you can play it. You could try to play a game somewhere else that does that better. And if you play with friends, I think it's worth talking about being able to say, not just hope that it works out, how specifically you think the combat might be fun. And this is hard to do. That's challenging. I'm here to help. Bionicme, I noticed that in the time since I recorded this parlay and the time since you submitted this parlay and I recorded it, you became a full-time parlay patron. So just by the way, I'm perfectly happy to go more into detail on any of that stuff if that's what you want for more parlay. I would love to talk about this more, but to cover this topic adequately, a topic I was very excited to cover, I took way longer than usual, even just getting to this point. So I'm sorry that we can't just do it all in this one. I would love to talk about this more, and you have more parlay slots now, I can see. So go for it. Hit me up. I think that's mostly what I've got for now. I hope that I've given enough, at least like drawing out the reasoning behind why maybe people would feel this way. I do just have one closing thought. I think that for some Magic the Gathering groups, and I know I can relate to this feeling a little, I've brought a deck with board wipes and counterspells, and my opponents haven't had them, and I win, and they felt like that was unfair. I mean, this hasn't happened recently because I didn't find that a fulfilling way to win and stopped playing that way. But, well, I mean, I play that way, but now I have a whole bunch of all my friends play that way too. What I wanted when I was playing that way was for my opponents to have counterspells to counter my board wipes and counterspells. And in a competitive environment, since it's assumed people will do everything they can to win, it's just assumed that people will bring the tools to like stop their opponent from interfering. I think that's fun. There comes a point where you arrive at an enjoyment of deck building where the fun thing about a strategy is that it is robust. Not that you can just magical Christmas land do everything you want, but that you can get away with some of what you want to do because the support for that strategy, the protection for that strategy is like pretty good. And that way of making decks can be really exciting, where you feel the pressure from your opponents. You can use that feeling like other opponents' way of playing can affect what your sort of objective wall to build your deck against is. You can use that for fun, for good. It can be fun to have that there. And one of the reasons why it's such a shame that people have misblamed counterspells and board wipes for this, rather than just deck building philosophy and the way that decks appear to be winning, is that one of the most fun things about Magic can be that you have that kind of known pressure from your opponents. You can count on your opponents to be trying to counterspell your stuff, and therefore a creature that cannot be countered, for example, is good. In some ways I feel like that's ideal, a beautiful way to play Magic. And yet I think for a lot of people, the competitive EDH, the competitive commander, that is popular with some circles is still not quite targeting the experience a lot of people want. Again, commander as it is just too broad, in my opinion. It's not even close to being specific enough to be like the thing a lot of people are looking for. But I would define that thing as being similar to competitive EDH, competitive commander, but slowed down somewhat, a notch somehow. And doing those things simultaneously, slowing it down a notch, but also everybody brings the tools to win in the most cutthroat way possible, but just less powerful of those tools, perhaps. That's one way you could approach this. Another way I've approached it is like answers that are a little too mana efficient. I've tried to give every deck a whole mountain of interaction, but not too mana efficient, so that at any given time, every deck can do something about a threat brought to the board, but not for too little mana. Thus, you really have to commit to stopping that threat, and it becomes a decision everyone can always make. Everyone always can stop a given threat on the board, but it's a matter of like, do you stop that one or do you spend that resource elsewhere? That can be fun, and there are a lot of ways to achieve that. I just want to encourage people, if you want to try to literally make a format, basically, which is kind of the problem here in Magic, you can do that. Like, it's possible to do that. It might be somewhat hard to get everyone on the same page, but that's a thing you can do. Okay, yeah, we gotta stop. Thanks to this parlay. I'm sorry it took a long time to make. Thank you for becoming a parlay patron. Folks, if you'd like to join Bionicme and submit some parlay of your own, you can do that using a link in the description. We'd love to have you. Looking forward to the next one.